Anthony Morris is a little turd who worked his way up by protecting, abetting, helping guys like my father, child rapists.
The apostates and our enemies accuse us of being a cult. I hate that.
Now think about this. We will not need doctors or lawyers after Armageddon. This is the only begotten Son of God, and you're going to try to tempt him to worship you. That was all it took to erase one of the most recognizable faces in the Watchtower organization. For nearly 20 years, Anthony Morris stood at the very top. He delivered speeches watched by millions. He helped shape policies that affected Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. To many members, he wasn't just a leader. He was one of the men guiding God's organization on earth. Then suddenly, he was gone. No detailed announcement, no farewell speech, no explanation, just one short statement. At first, some thought it was retirement, but then strange details began to emerge. Morris disappeared from broadcasts. New leaders appeared almost immediately. Major organizational changes followed, and the man who once spoke so confidently to millions became almost completely silent. Was this simply a retirement, or was something happening behind the scenes that nobody was supposed to see? Because the deeper we investigate Anthony Morris's disappearance, the more one uncomfortable question begins to emerge. What if Anthony Morris wasn't the story? What if he was the warning sign? And what if the warning sign points to something far larger, far darker, and far more disturbing than anyone inside the organization is willing to admit? Long before the controversy, before the rumors, and years before the mysterious announcement, Anthony Morris was considered a success story inside the organization. His journey began far from Watchtower headquarters. Before becoming a Jehovah's Witness, Morris served in the Vietnam War. Like many veterans, he returned to a world very different from the one he had left. Struggling to find purpose and direction, he eventually found the Jehovah's Witnesses. In 1971, he was baptized, and from that point forward, his rise was remarkably steady. He became an elder, then a circuit overseer, then a respected figure within the organization's leadership structure. Year after year, he climbed higher, each position bringing him closer to the inner circle of Watchtower authority. What makes this part of the story important is that positions at the very top of the organization are extraordinarily rare. Out of 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, only a handful of men ever reached the governing body. Yet in 2005, Anthony Morris achieved what many witnesses would consider one of the highest privileges possible. He was appointed to the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. That appointment placed him among the small group of men responsible for directing the entire worldwide organization. For loyal members, that position carried enormous spiritual significance. These weren't simply administrators. According to Watchtower theology, they were believed to be part of the faithful and discreet slave class described in Scripture, the very channel through which God's direction flowed to his people on earth. Morris didn't simply hold authority, he projected authority. His speaking style was direct, his language was confident, his talks often left very little room for uncertainty or nuance. Supporters saw unwavering conviction. Critics saw inflexibility and a willingness to make statements that left members feeling judged or condemned. And while Morris was becoming one of the organization's most recognizable leaders, a series of controversies were quietly building in the background. Controversies that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Before the liquor store incident, before the removal announcement, there was something else. A pattern of public statements that generated enormous controversy both inside and outside the Jehovah's Witness community. Anthony Morris was known for speaking boldly, but some of his recorded statements crossed lines that even loyal members found difficult to explain or defend. He publicly commented on clothing choices, specifically targeting what he described as tight pants worn by young men, suggesting such clothing was connected to homosexuality and was being promoted by the gay community. The statement was recorded, shared widely online, and immediately generated both mockery and genuine concern from mental health professionals and former members alike. He made statements about higher education that alarmed parents and young people within the organization. Morris repeatedly discouraged Jehovah's Witnesses from pursuing college or university degrees. He suggested that seeking higher education demonstrated a lack of faith in the coming paradise. He described universities as dangerous spiritual environments, places that could corrupt young witnesses and pull them away from the organization. The consequences of this position were devastating for families who followed it. Research conducted by former members and sociologists studying new religious movements has documented cases of young Jehovah's Witnesses who abandoned career opportunities, refused scholarships, and entered adulthood without professional qualifications because of organizational discouragement toward higher education. And there were statements about women, about perceived rebellion, about the dangers of independent thinking. Talk after talk reinforced a worldview in which obedience to the governing body was placed above individual conscience, family relationships, and in some disturbing cases, even personal safety. Critics began documenting these statements systematically. Former members created archives, journalists started paying attention, and the picture that emerged was troubling. Here was one of the most powerful leaders in an 8 million member worldwide religious organization making statements that would have been considered deeply alarming if they had come from almost any other public figure. Yet inside the organization, questioning those statements could result in serious consequences. Then came 2019. A video surfaced online. The footage itself was simple. No hidden meetings, no dramatic confrontation, no leaked documents. Just Anthony Morris leaving a liquor store in New Jersey and loading multiple bottles of expensive Scotch whiskey into his vehicle. At first glance, that might not seem like a major scandal. Jehovah's Witnesses are not prohibited from drinking alcohol, but critics immediately focused on two specific details that made this situation uniquely complicated. First, this wasn't an ordinary member. This was a governing body member, one of the men believed by Jehovah's Witnesses to be spiritually directing God's organization on earth. Second, observers questioned the quantity and cost of the purchase. The bottles included were not inexpensive, and the amount purchased appeared inconsistent with the image Morris projected in his public talks, where he frequently spoke about modesty, restraint, and the dangers of materialism. The video spread rapidly through former witness communities and religious discussion channels. Questions followed almost immediately. Why was a leader known for lecturing others about modesty purchasing luxury alcohol? Would an ordinary witness face scrutiny from elders for similar behavior? And perhaps most importantly, would the organization respond? Many expected some form of public response. None came. No official investigation was announced. No public clarification was issued. No statement of any kind appeared. The organization remained completely silent. The controversy faded from official discussion, but something about that silence lingered, because within Watchtower culture, ordinary members can be called before a judicial committee for behaviors far less publicly visible than this video showed. Elders routinely investigate members for perceived violations of organizational standards. People are disfellowshipped, publicly shamed, and cut off from their families for private matters. Yet one of the most powerful men in the organization appeared in a widely circulated video, generating worldwide discussion, and received no public accountability whatsoever. If that double standard wasn't disturbing enough on its own, what came next made it even harder to ignore. Most people focus on the announcement, but some observers believe the real mystery started much earlier. Months before Anthony Morris was officially removed, something subtle began happening. He seemed to be disappearing from public view. At first, almost nobody noticed. Why would they? The governing body consists of multiple members. Not everyone appears in every broadcast. Gaps happen, schedules change. But as time passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. New broadcasts were released, new updates were shared, other governing body members appeared regularly, yet one of the organization's most recognizable faces seemed increasingly absent. Was it health-related? Was retirement being discussed behind closed doors? Nobody outside a very small circle knew, and that made the situation deeply unusual. Anthony Morris wasn't a background figure. His talks had generated significant reactions for years. His comments were discussed, debated, and sometimes mocked across thousands of online communities. His personality was distinctive. People noticed when he spoke, which meant people eventually noticed when he stopped speaking. Then another uncomfortable detail appeared. While Morris was quietly fading from broadcasts, the organization itself was facing growing external pressure, unlike anything it had experienced in decades. Legal challenges were expanding across multiple countries. Child abuse lawsuits were multiplying at an alarming rate. In Australia, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse had already exposed deeply disturbing failures within the Watchtower organization. Investigators revealed that the organization had maintained internal records of accused abusers, records that had never been shared with law enforcement authorities. The numbers that emerged from that investigation were staggering. Over 1,000 alleged perpetrators had been identified in Watchtower records in Australia alone. 1,000 cases that were handled internally, kept secret, and hidden from police. In the United States, court cases involving child sexual abuse claims against the organization were resulting in massive financial judgments. In one California case, the organization was ordered to pay over $2 million in damages. In another, the judgment reached over $35 million before negotiations began. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a documented systemic pattern that researchers, lawyers, and survivors had been trying to expose for years. And while all of this was happening, one of the organization's most outspoken leaders was quietly disappearing from public broadcasts. Coincidence, possibly, but then February 2023 arrived. On February 22, 2023, the mystery moved from quiet speculation to undeniable reality. The announcement appeared on the organization's official website. It was extraordinarily brief, one sentence. Anthony Morris III was no longer serving as a member of the governing body. That was it. No explanation, no reason given, no farewell message, no public acknowledgement of nearly 20 years of service, no tribute, no gratitude expressed, nothing that would indicate a voluntary retirement being celebrated by an organization grateful for decades of leadership. For most institutions of any kind, the departure of a leader at that level would generate extensive statements, public tributes, and carefully crafted messaging designed to maintain stability and respect among followers. But not this time. The silence was deafening. And Anthony Morris wasn't a local elder or a regional representative. According to Watchtower theology, he was one of the men believed to be spiritually directing the worldwide organization under divine guidance. If God was working through these men, how could one of them simply vanish in a single sentence? What happened next made the situation even more intriguing. On the very same day Morris was removed, the organization announced 2 new governing body members. Not 1, 2. The transition happened almost instantaneously. 1 leader disappeared, 2 leaders arrived. The organization moved forward without missing a single step. To some observers, this looked like ordinary succession planning. To others, it raised a deeply uncomfortable question. Why was the replacement already prepared? Why 2 new members on the exact same day? Was this transition planned far in advance? And if so, for how long had the organization known this moment was coming while saying absolutely nothing to its members? There are no public answers, only more questions. If the story had ended with the announcement, many questions would have eventually faded, but it didn't. In the months following Anthony Morris's removal, some of the most significant organizational adjustments in recent Watchtower history began to appear, and the timing caused observers to pay very close attention. For decades, reporting field service hours had been one of the most recognizable practices among Jehovah's Witnesses. Every publisher every month reported exactly how many hours they had spent in door-to-door ministry. The numbers were tracked, reviewed by elders, and used to assess a member's spiritual standing within the congregation. Then suddenly, the reporting system changed dramatically. The requirement to report specific hours was significantly modified. For many witnesses, it was one of the most unexpected organizational shifts they had witnessed in years. Then came the beard adjustment. For a very long time, facial hair had been strongly discouraged among Jehovah's Witness men in many parts of the world. Elders and ministerial servants were expected to be clean-shaven. Brothers who grew beards could find their congregation privileges quietly removed. The cultural pressure was intense and consistent. Then, following Morris's departure, the organizational tone on beards appeared to shift. The approach became noticeably different. These changes generated enormous discussion among both current and former members, and some observers couldn't help noticing the timing. Anthony Morris was known as one of the most conservative voices on the governing body. His talks frequently emphasized strict adherence to organizational standards. His rhetoric often focused on what members should not wear, should not pursue, and should not think independently about. Was it possible that his departure created space for a different kind of leadership to emerge? There is no public evidence proving a direct connection, but the timing has proven impossible for many observers to simply dismiss. After Anthony Morris was removed from the governing body, observers began noticing something unusual about his whereabouts. He had relocated, not to Watchtower headquarters in Warwick, New York, not to one of the organization's major international branch facilities. Instead, Morris and his wife became associated with a residence in North Carolina. For people already trying to understand his sudden departure, the location raised immediate questions. Why North Carolina? Why move so far from the organizational center? And why was there still absolutely no public explanation of any kind? Then another detail surfaced. Property records appeared to show additional real estate connections in the area. Almost immediately, speculation exploded through former member communities online. Some critics argued the situation suggested something highly unusual was unfolding. Others insisted there was likely a far more ordinary explanation. The verified facts remained limited, but the questions multiplied. And through all of it, Anthony Morris remained completely silent. No interviews, no public statements, no social media presence, no attempts through any channel to explain his departure, clarify the circumstances, or communicate with the millions of witnesses who had once listened to his every word. For a man who had spent years speaking boldly to audiences of millions, the total and complete silence was perhaps the most striking detail of all. Here is where the story becomes something far larger than one man. Because while Anthony Morris was disappearing, something else was happening simultaneously. Jehovah's Witnesses were leaving in numbers that the organization had never previously experienced. The rise of the internet had fundamentally changed the landscape. For decades, the organization had maintained extraordinary control over the information its members could access. Members were strongly discouraged from reading anything critical of the organization. Former members were shunned completely, making it nearly impossible for their experiences to reach active witnesses. But the internet broke that wall open. Former members began sharing their experiences on YouTube channels that accumulated hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Websites dedicated to documenting watchtower policies and court cases reached audiences of millions. The Australian Royal Commission findings spread across social media platforms. Court judgments were reported by mainstream news organizations. Child abuse survivors began telling their stories publicly in numbers that proved impossible to dismiss or contain. And something began happening that the organization's leadership had never fully anticipated. Active witnesses, people still attending meetings and reporting field service hours, began quietly researching. They found the court records. They found the survivor testimonies. They found the videos of governing body members making statements that seemed to contradict the image of humble, spirit-guided leaders. They found the liquor store video. They found the archived talks about tight pants and higher education. They found the one-sentence removal announcement, and they began asking questions they had never felt safe asking before. The organization's own research has acknowledged significant membership challenges in Western countries. Independent researchers who study religious demographic trends have documented membership stagnation and decline in multiple regions where the organization once grew consistently. The people leaving aren't simply drifting away casually. Many are leaving with documented grievances. They are leaving because of child abuse policies that prioritized organizational reputation over victim protection. They are leaving because of shunning practices that destroyed their family relationships. They are leaving because of the two-witness rule, an internal standard requiring two witnesses to an act of wrongdoing before disciplinary action can be taken. A standard that critics argue made it nearly impossible to hold abusers accountable in cases where abuse occurred in private. They are leaving because decades of promises about an imminent paradise that has never arrived have finally exhausted their patience and their faith. And they are leaving because, when one of the most powerful men in the organization disappeared without a single meaningful explanation, it confirmed something many of them had quietly suspected for years. The institution they trusted with their entire lives may not have been what it claimed to be. Let's look at everything one final time. A powerful leader rises through the ranks and becomes one of the most recognizable faces in a worldwide religious organization. He makes controversial public statements for years without accountability. A video surfaces generating international discussion. No response comes. He begins disappearing from public broadcasts. A one-sentence announcement removes him from leadership. Two replacements arrive immediately. Major organizational policy changes follow. He relocates far from organizational headquarters, and then total silence descends. Simultaneously, the organization faces expanding legal challenges across multiple countries related to child sexual abuse. Court judgments reach into the tens of millions of dollars. Government investigations expose internal records hidden from law enforcement. Millions of members begin accessing information the organization spent decades trying to suppress, and people leave in numbers that challenge the organization's carefully maintained image of steady worldwide growth. Some believe Morris's departure was simply a retirement handled with unfortunate brevity. Others believe internal disagreements reached a point where removal became unavoidable. Still others believe his departure represents the clearest visible evidence of a much larger and much darker transition happening inside the organization. The truth is that nobody outside a very small and very closed circle knows with certainty. And that may be the most important part of the entire story. Because when one of the most visible leaders in modern watchtower history can disappear without a meaningful public explanation, it forces a much larger question into the open. If this much can happen behind closed doors without accountability or transparency, how many other stories remain hidden from the 8 million people who trust this organization with their lives, their families, their futures, and their faith? And more importantly, how many of those 8 million people are quietly beginning to ask that exact same question right now? The silence from Anthony Morris continues. But the questions it created refuse to stay silent. And that silence may ultimately prove to be the most powerful testimony of all.